Hey, how you doing? The other day I had a really interesting conversation with a customer. We were talking about gear ratios on a fishing reel, but we weren't talking so much about the number that you see on the side of the box, like the 5.3 to 1 and the 4.1 to 1, but we'll touch on that in a second. We actually were talking about the benefits of a low gear reel versus a mid gear reel versus a high gear reel. Now, if you go through my library, you're going to see a video I did about 6 years ago where I talk about what those numbers represent. So just quickly for now, for the beginners, I just want to reiterate what that means. And you can go back and look at the video on your own time. On the side of a box for a reel, you're going to find the specifications, the specs. And you're going to see something that looks like this. Say 5.3 to 1. That's a ratio. Now, you know what a ratio is, right? It's just another way of dividing one number into another. It's a quantitative relationship between two amounts. You remember that from high school math, don't you? Yeah? No? Okay. Well, anyway, it's just another way of dividing something into another amount. So what that means is that number 1 you see on the right-hand side of the ratio, that is the number of rotations that is made of the reel handle. All right. The number on the left-hand side of the ratio is the rotations that either the spool or the bail arms, depending on what type of reel it is going to rotate for each turn of the handle. That's the ratio. Now, the lower the left-hand number is, the slower the reel, the higher, the faster the reel is. That's the faster gear ratio versus a slow gear ratio. So what is the benefit of having a low, a medium, and a high gear ratio reel? Well, if you need a reel that has some torque in it, that has some strength for heavy reeling, like for big fish, you're going to look for a reel that has a low gear ratio. It's just like a car. When you need to get it up that hill, you've got to put it into a lower gear. Otherwise, it's just not going to go anywhere. So low gear ratio reels are really good when you need torque, when you're fishing for the big fish, the heavy guys, all right? So a low gear ratio is about, 4 to 1, 4.1 to 1, maybe a bit lower, up to 5.1 to 1. That's usually the low gear ratio. Now, a mid gear ratio, anything from 5.2 to 1 up to 6.1 to 1, is usually what the average recreational angler uses. That gear ratio is excellent for things like spinner baits, for swim baits, for inline spinners, because they don't overwork the lure. They let it swim in a natural pattern. If you're too slow or too fast, the lure will be have an unnatural swim pattern, and it may discourage the fish and not attract it. Okay, so they're good for that type of fishing. Now, your high gear reels are anything from 6.2 to 1 and up. Now, where would you use that? Well, you use those reels when you need a quick uptake on the line. Now, what I mean when I say uptake is, when you cast out, you're going to notice a kind of slack in your line from the tip of your rod down to your terminal tackle. There's a slack the moment it hits the water and stops moving. When you're doing certain fishing like ultralight finesse, for example, or bass fishing, you're going to want to take up that slack quickly. That's the take up. That is starting your reel and taking up that slack and putting some tension on that line so that you can manipulate your bait. Or if you have a fish on the line and you need a quick uptake, that is when you would use a high gear reel. Bass anglers and ultralight finesse anglers love high gear reels. Okay, so to recap, if you need something with a bit of guts and torque because you got the big guys, you're going to use a low gear ratio reel. Everyday angling, throwing it off the dock side of the boat, using your swim baits, your spinner baits, things like that, your mid-range gear ratios, okay? And if you need a quick uptake, something fast, you're going to use a high gear ratio reel. Now, I'm also going to mention something else that goes along with the gear ratio. You're going to see on the box another thing called IPT, that is inches per turn. That is the rate of return of the line when you're reeling in. So if you have a slow gear ratio reel or a low gear ratio reel, that intake is going to be obviously less than something that is a high gear ratio. Now, for example, the average uptake and intake of line on a slow gear or a low gear ratio reel is usually between 24 to maybe 29 inches per turn. When you go to the mid ratio, you're going to look at about 28 inches to maybe 32 inches. These are approximations, by the way. And when you get into the fast or the high gear reels, you're going to be anything from 34 to 38, 39 inches per turn. All right. So that is basically what your gear ratio and your IPT represent on the stats, or the, I should say, specs that you find on the side of your reel box. So depending on what you want to do, if you need torque, low. If you're just doing everyday angling, you need medium. And if you need a quick uptake because you're bass fishing or you're finesse fishing, and you go to a high-speed reel. Okay, high gear ratios. I hope that explains things next time you're out looking at your reel. So anyway, thanks for listening to me. Until the next time, this is Sharon saying, tight lines.